Hey guys, Patrick Coker out here once again talking to folks about the 10 Commandments, doing some serious investigations. Let's talk about coveting.
Okay.
Have you ever coveted?
Yes.
What? You don't have to answer that. So what are your thoughts? Why is it wrong to want what someone else has?
Because we weren't given it. I mean, God didn't choose for it to be ours, so why should we decide it's not in our plan?
You know what it means to covet? Covet just means wanting what someone else has. Do you feel like that's wrong?
I don't think it's wrong. I think it's honestly pretty involuntary to want what someone else wants. Envy is a really regular feeling to have. I think it's how you act with it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, when they feel envious, they turn it into tearing down others because of their envy. But I don't think it's bad to have envy. I think it's bad if you react in a bad way.
Okay, there's one called covet, and so basically that means wanting what someone else has. Have you ever had that feeling before?
Oh yeah, definitely. Rich people, you see it all over social media. I would love to have that lifestyle, but it's not anything that I could probably have in this life from being realistic.
Let's talk Instagram and the TikToks and the Facebooks and the Twitters. Okay, let's talk about social media. Do you feel like people putting these images out there make it hard for you to be content with what you have and not want what others have?
Yes, yeah, because it's very easy to be I have this, I'm happy with it, but then when I see someone else having it, it's easy to say, well, if I had it, I would be happier.
My grandmother always said comparison is the thief of joy, and I think that is very much true. You see the best of what people put out there, and when you're looking at somebody's seemingly perfect life while your child is in the middle of having a tantrum in the living room floor, you can certainly let that bring you down as a parent.
I do feel that social media has that effect on people because, even the way I dress, I'm I look at social media and I see that and I'm wow, I want to be like that, or I want to look cool like that, or I want to be able to dress that certain way or feel this certain way. I think it's negative. I really don't like how that social media affects it, but it does without you really knowing.
It's a pleasure, as always, to be here with you this morning. If you're a guest, and I see some guests in the room with us today, thank you so much for choosing to worship with us this morning. It's truly a blessing to have you with us. And also, if you're joining us and you're tuning in online, thank you so much for joining us online as well and choosing to worship with us, even though you're not physically present with us this morning. We'll be looking at the 10th commandment today. Today, we'll be finishing up our sermon series, For Our Good Always. And as we get into this command, there's something specific that I want us to consider to get our minds going in the right direction. Have you ever noticed potentially in yourself or in others how oftentimes it can become completely paralyzing to make a big life decision? Sometimes for us, sometimes for others, it's difficult because oftentimes we have desires within ourselves that are at war with each other. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. It is appropriate to weigh the pros and cons when you're making big decisions. But I'm talking about when I was in college, and I remember seeing many people who were paralyzed to pick a major, right? Who were paralyzed about this decision that would cause or affect the way that their lives going forward. They had desires, and they found pros with this major, and had desires pushing them towards this, and they kind of were in this prison of indecision. They kind of were in this prison of, I don't know what to do, and I can't even take appropriate steps forward. Maybe this happens when you're looking for a house or deciding where you're going to live, or maybe what career you're going to choose. Oftentimes we find ourselves enslaved to our own desires, to our own preferences. We find ourselves paralyzed and imprisoned to those conflicting desires. Deuteronomy Chapter 5, verse 21 talks a lot about our desires, what we want. And I want to dive deeply into what this passage is showing us. Deuteronomy Chapter 5, verse 21, I read it again. Reads, and you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant, or his female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. That the Hebrew word that's translated covet there means to desire, to take great pleasure in. It's a word that can be translated as lust as well. This unceasing desire to have, to possess something that doesn't currently belong to you. Biblically, the call not to covet the things that our neighbor has is the call to not desire the things that they have too much, to not believe that you will be content if you just have this thing that you see that someone else has. To have an idea of what you covet, you might seek to answer this question, man, I would be okay if I just had blank, this thing that I see someone else with. I mean, I don't need $1 million or anything like that. But I'd be content if I had blank. Which means, biblically speaking, coveting is an issue of faith. It's an issue of faith in at least a couple ways. It's believing that God got it wrong in your life. It's doubting God. It's not having faith that God proportioned to you or gave to you what he should have. It's a lack of faith in God's provision for you. It's believing that what God has given you isn't enough. And we'll look at Psalm 16, verses 5 through 6. We'll circle back to this one maybe a couple times later throughout this sermon. Chapter 16, verses 5 through 6. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. Verse 6. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. In verse 6, when David says that the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places, he's talking about potentially his physical lot, the physical land that he owns. But I believe he's getting at something even deeper than that. I believe he's actually talking about the lot of his life. That he's talking to his God, and he's saying the lines that determine the lot of my life, what I have and what I do not have, what I possess and what I do not possess. He says they've fallen in pleasant places. He says, indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. And I believe that is what God desires for all of us to experience, a posture he desires for all of us to have, to be able to say that God has done a good and faithful and just job in assigning to me my lot in this life. And covetousness is believing that the lines have not fallen in the right places for you, and that they have fallen in the right places for someone else. And you want God to extend the lines for you into someone else's lot, that you desire to have what they have, that you believe your lot should be expanded to include what someone else has, because yours isn't good enough as it is. Covetousness is placing faith in something other than God to be what you need for contentment in this life. It's a matter of faith. It's a matter of belief. It's believing that something else, I need more than what God has given me. There's something else I'm putting my faith and my hope in to make me okay, to make me content in this life. And I see that someone else has that. And so I covet that. The 10th commandment is a command to not look at something that someone else has and believe that you'd be content in life if you had that. And the Apostle Paul is right when he actually calls covetousness idolatry. Look at Colossians chapter 3, verse 5. He says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. That's why I say covetousness is a matter of faith. It's believing in a false God. It's believing that something else can be for you what only God can truly be for you. It's placing your faith in something temporary in this world. The apostle says, if you break the 10th commandment, you've also broken the first commandment, which is don't put any gods before him. He's pointing out that if your desire for some things are too strong, you're in sin, you're practicing idolatry because you're putting something else over God. And when you do that, you give that thing enormous power in your life. Enormous power. Whatever you put your faith in to give you true and ultimate contentment in your life, you will be controlled by that thing. And that's why when Jesus is calling us to not covet or love money, he says you can't serve two what? Masters. No one has said anything about something about a master or anything mastering anybody else. When he's talking about your desire for more money, he flips it and says you can't have two masters. Either I'm going to be your master or money will be your master. Why does he say that? Because when you believe that you can find life in something and ultimate contentment in something, it masters you. It controls you. It shackles you. It enslaves you. And that's one of the tests of whether or not you just want something or if you covet something. How much does your desire for that thing control you? How much power does it have? It's okay to desire to have things. It's okay to desire something that you don't have, but when that thing begins to control you, when that thing becomes your master, you're walking in covetousness. You can desire something so much that you grieve the fact that you don't have it without coveting that thing. So I just want to make sure I'm clear. This is possible. I want to make sure that we understand that before I get into what it looks like to be enslaved by that desire, that there are things, there are potentially good things that you don't have, that you can grieve even to the point of tears. That doesn't mean you're coveting. There's some of us who desire to have children that don't have children. You grieve that, and that is okay. It's okay to grieve that. It's okay to be sad about those things. There's nothing wrong with that. But I would say that when those desires to have something that someone else has, when those things are enslaving us, then we have reason to believe we are disobeying the 10th commandment. For example, if you desire something that someone has so much that you no longer like them, or you can't see them as a brother or sister in Christ anymore, you can't treat them in that way, you don't desire to fellowship with them, you don't desire to walk in unity and oneness with them, then you're likely coveting what they have in your heart. That desire is controlling you, it's mastering you, it's leading you away from love, which means it's leading you away from what God has for your life. This can happen in or with romantic relationships. You want to be with someone, but now they're with someone else. I don't want us to miss the fact that the very first thing that he tells us not to covet in that verse in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 21 is someone else's spouse. Or chapter 5, verse 21, excuse me. Is someone else's spouse. This is the very first thing he goes to as he's telling us not to covet. Relational coveting is a real thing. And one way to tell if your desire is just a harmless desire, if it's coveting, is by asking the question, is this desire to possess this thing leading me to sin in any way? For married people in the room, for married people joining us online. Look, I know. On birthdays and anniversaries, you posting about how you can't imagine your life without your spouse. I know. I seen the post. I know how on birthdays and anniversaries, you just can't imagine any other way of living other than with that person. But I want to talk about on times when things are a little bit more difficult, when things are a little bit more challenging, when there are rough patches in the relationship. And when you start to have that question in your mind, maybe it's like this. Maybe it's like this. Maybe it's someone else's birthday or anniversary. And you see someone else bragging about all the things that their spouse does for them, things that you desire for your spouse to do for you, but for whatever reason, maybe they don't do those things. The question that this commandment causes us to ask ourselves is, are we feeding these desires in our own heart? Are we allowing these desires to lurk and grow and be cultivated in our own hearts? Do we allow these sinful thoughts that are damaging and destructive to our marriages, do we allow them to fester in our hearts? This command, it confronts us when we have ongoing desires for someone else's partner. This command, it calls us out of the rabbit trail that our mind often takes us down, that often begins with the question, man, wouldn't it be nice to be with them? Wouldn't it be nice to have that thing or for them to do that thing for me that they're doing for someone else? I don't know what comes to your mind when you hear of someone that genuinely cares about their spouse, genuinely cares about their children, then they end up having an affair. I don't know what comes to your mind when you hear that. I don't know what your thoughts are about the person that does that, but I'll tell you what comes to my mind. That person is enslaved. That person is enslaved to their desires. That person has been conquered and mastered oftentimes by their desires. They don't know how to say no. Those desires have grown. Maybe it started as a small seed, but it just grew and grew and grew in the strength of the desire to the point where now it has taken over and conquered that person. They know the risk. They know the risk of the pain for them and for their families. But those desires likely have gone unchecked. And what happens to a lot of married people, and this is one of the ways you can tell that you're enslaved by your desires. What happens to a lot of married people is when you're single, you really, really strongly desire to get married. And you see others who are married, and that's a good thing. It's not an ultimate thing, but it's a good thing to be married. The Bible says so. It doesn't say it's better than being single. It just says both of them are good things. So what happens oftentimes, the way you can tell that we are enslaved is oftentimes we desire that, and then you get married, and now you covet in the freedoms of singleness. So when you're single, you're desiring to be married. When you're married, you're coveting the freedom of singleness. And for many married people, it puts you in this place of ongoing discontentment. Why? Because you're mastered by your desires. And you have strong desires pulling you in two different directions. That's a fruit of being enslaved to our desires. So now we have this deeply rooted discontentment. Maybe you have this deeply rooted bitterness or resentment towards your spouse or towards your marriage, and you find yourself desiring to get out. And the whole time you just think you're trying to do what's making you happy. And the Bible is saying, no, you're coveting. No, you're coveting. And that's why you have this rampant discontentment in your life. And we spend our lives in discontentment because we do not wage war against our covetousness. And on the heart level, I would say oftentimes single people do the same thing. You can covet the person that someone else is dating or married to when you're single as well. You can covet friendships that someone has. Don't get me wrong. It's not wrong to desire more deep and fulfilling friendships, but you're enslaved to them when those desires start to lead you away from God. When you become enslaved to those desires, when maybe there's someone that you desire to have more of a friendship with, and you see someone else having a closer friendship with them than you desire, now you have some type of harsh feelings towards one or both of them. It's because of covetousness. And one of the reasons I find it so important to point these things out, because some of us, when you're talking to other Christians about it, we say things like, when these desires aren't met, we say things like, yeah, I'm just really struggling in my faith right now. Yeah, I'm just really having doubts about God right now. And that's true. And that's real. That's a very real thing oftentimes that you should say, but I want you to go ahead and complete and be thorough in everything you're describing and everything you're confessing. It's not just some doubts or whatever just creep their way into your mind. No, you were coveting something. God did not give it to you. And now you're doubting God's goodness because you're thinking, well, God wants me to be happy, right? So he's going to give me the things that make me happy. And now I'm doubting the very goodness of God. Do you see how covetousness can enslave you? Do you see how covetousness can work its way into your heart? God is doing us a favor. God is showing his goodness to us when he tells us not to covet. He knows many people have walked away from him. Why? Because they begin to desire things and believe I'll be content if I have this thing. And God, for whatever reason, at that time in his sovereignty, is not giving it to us. And now we're doubting God. Now you're doubting the God that saved you because he didn't give you this temporary thing that you desire. You need to understand what's happening in your heart. It's covetousness, and God in this 10th command, in his love, he's calling us out of this. He's calling us away from this. He's saying, no, don't covet things that aren't yours. These desires enslave us. And as we look at the text, we see that there are multiple categories of things that we can covet. I'll go back to verse 21. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not despise or desire your neighbor's house, his field. This is talking about the property or land that others have that we can covet after. Maybe it's the size of someone's house or the size of someone's land, or maybe it's where someone lives that you desire to live. Maybe you thought that at this point in your life, you'd be at a place where you have the type of things that you see other people having. But you're just not there yet, and you feel you'd be content if you had the type of job or the type of home or whatever material possessions that others have. Maybe you're looking at others the same age as you, and you see them having the things that you wanted and the things that you thought that you would have at this point. It's creating this feeling of anxiety in you. And God is saying, don't covet those things. Don't covet those things. In his love, he's telling us not to covet those things. I'll continue reading in the verse. It says, or his male servant or his female servant, his ox or his donkey. Oftentimes, the people that would have a house, a field, a male servant, a female servant, an ox, or a donkey were people who had some type of wealth. They were able to accrue a lot of possessions that others weren't able to have. And maybe you see someone who just has so much more money than you or more affluence than you, and you covet that. You want their lot in life. Maybe they're able to go on vacations that you can't go on, or eat at places that you can't afford to eat at, and you covet the ability to enjoy the things that they have and the things that they enjoy. And I love it when God does this at the end of this verse, in case he didn't hit the specific thing that you're coveting or anything that is your neighbor's, he says, or anything that your neighbor possesses. God saying, I'm coming for all toes today. All toes. Amen. The people who had the servants and the ox and the donkey, again, they often had a lot of wealth, but maybe it's not wealth. Maybe it's someone's overall lot in life. I believe if you look at this passage, yes, he's itemizing out a few different things that we can covet. And I think that's the emphasis, is those specific things. But I think also there's something bigger here. I think there's a bigger picture here. When you look at the different types of categories, these are often the things that kind of determine what we would consider someone's lot in their life. Their home, where they spend most of their time. Their spouse, the person they spend most of their time with. The different things that they have to help them get done, the things they need to get done, like an ox, the way that they work, or maybe how they are able to work and what their work is able to provide for them. As I zoom out a bit, it seems as if what he's communicating here is also maybe what we would consider the sum of someone's lot in life. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. That's relationship. You shall not desire your neighbor's house or field. That's property, material possessions. And since this verse talks about not coveting your neighbor's stuff, you might be tempted to believe it's only talking about people who live in your general area. But in today's age, where we can be very aware of many of the activities that people engage in, even if they're on the other side of the world, I think we need to broaden our view of who might fit into this category of neighbor for us when it comes to who we might be coveting after. It used to be that people whose possessions you see when you are physically in their presence, then that's what you might be able to covet that someone else has. But today, right here in your pocket, many of you have this thing called Instagram, right in your pocket. Some of you got this thing called Tickety Talk. What is it? What is the newest thing that people are into right now? The Tickety Talks. The Tickety Talk. And all it takes for some of us is one photo with some almost deep, kind of inspirational quote for the caption that's attached to it, that you just need to do you. That's all you need. One picture, one almost deep quote for us to be thrown into coveting. Needless to say, if we spend hours upon hours throughout our days scrolling, seeing so many things that other people are doing that we desire to do, there's been study after study that has come out that has said that high uses of social media oftentimes leads to anxiety. And a lot of people are saying I would say sociologists are saying that a lot of that is likely because we are comparing ourselves, we are comparing our lot, if I can use that term, in life to the perceived lot of someone else, just the highlights of their life, just the highlights. We're comparing it to the highlights of someone else, and now we think something is wrong with our life. We think something is wrong with our lot in life. We're looking at others and what they're doing and what they're able to experience, a place they're able to go, and we're thinking, what's wrong with my life? Why doesn't my life include these things? What am I doing wrong? And it creates this sense of anxiety in us oftentimes because we feel like now we're not doing enough. Our life isn't good enough because we don't have those things that we see next to that almost deep quote that they put on there. Hashtag blessings. And we ask the question, what's wrong with me? Why don't I have that thing by now? What am I doing wrong? Listen, one photo should not have that kind of power over your life. Should not have that kind of power over your life. The reason that it does is because you covet. The reason that it does is because you covet, and coveting enslaves us. We give these things as power over our lives because of the way that we covet them. For some of you, you need to stop following certain people on social media. You need to just stop. You need to stop following them. Some of you need to stop following that influence on social media. because you know deep down you want to be them. You want their life, and it is fueling your discontentment with your life, and it's fueling your tendency to covet what your neighbor has. You want their lot in life, and the more you see it, the more you desire it. Some of us just need to stop using social media as much in general. Maybe you keep the account, but maybe you delete the app off of your phone. So I'm not saying social media in and of itself is evil. I'm saying sometimes we use it in a way that fuels, that feeds our covetousness. Sometimes we use it in a way that's harmful for us, that is enslaving us to these desires that we have. I was talking to a sister who greatly decreased her social media time. I think it was specifically Instagram, and around her birthday, her husband asked her, "What do you want?" And she said, I don't know what I want. Because people are no longer telling me or showing me what I should be wanting. Here's the reason I bring that up. So I bring that up for a very specific reason. Oftentimes, I think we perceive our desires to be who we are. I think we perceive, especially our strongest desires, to be who we are. We think they're just what they are, just like hardwired personality into us or something like that. Like we see these things as things that are not able to be changed. But this command is saying, no, don't covet these things. No, don't desire these things. And my point in bringing this up is to say that you actually have some amount of influence. You are able to impact your very desires. You're not just a passive victim of whatever your strongest desires are. You're not some helpless victim of those things. You can play a role in what you desire. I'll give you another example. This was earlier in our marriage. I think this was about a couch. It might have been about something else. So me and my wife were planning on getting a couch. And my wife asked me what kind of couch I want. And I was like, I don't care. I think it was a couch. It might be something else. What kind of couch you want? I don't care. Just whatever. Something I can sit on. And she was like, well, I'd like for us to make this decision together. Okay, cool. I'll look at some type of couches. 30 minutes later, I cared a lot about what type of couch we had. I had some strong desires and some opinions about what type of couch that we were going to get. And now because of that, I have the potential of experiencing frustration if we don't get the type of couch that I wanted. I want to submit to you today, I would have been better off if I would not looked at not one couch. And I just would have been content with, go get us a couch, something to sit on, maybe fall asleep on it sometime, watching a movie. Just give me a couch. What am I saying? Sometimes when you put your eyes on something, you're actually putting your heart on that thing. Oftentimes when you're looking at something, you're cultivating desire in your heart for whatever that thing is. I'm trying to tell you, you have some amount of agency, some amount of influence, some amount of impact into what you desire. You should consider this as you're considering whether or not you're falling or walking straight forward into discontentment and into covetousness. I got some Bible for you on that too. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. This is right before Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate it. That tree had always been in the garden. What is this verse emphasizing? What she saw, that it was a delight to her eyes. It was always there. Now she's looking at it more. Now she's looking at it differently. Obviously, she goes ahead and eats the fruit after she sees it. It was already there. All right, I got another Bible story for you. Many of you are familiar with the story of David, particularly David and Bathsheba. David was supposed to be at war. Instead, David was at his house, his castle, or whatever it was. He's looking out over his kingdom, looking out over everything that he has. He sees Bathsheba. She's bathing. He should not be watching her the way that he was. And if you're familiar with the story, his uncontrolled desire, his slavery to his desire leads to so much pain and so much suffering and so much death for him and his family, and for Uriah, who David ends up having murdered. Bathsheba had been in that kingdom. And Bathsheba wasn't doing anything wrong as far as how I interpret that passage. She had been in the kingdom. He saw her. He set his affection, or his desire, I should say, his lust, I should say, his covetousness, I should say, on her, as he allowed himself to be watching her in a way that was inappropriate, in a way that he should not have, and his desire takes control over him. He was looking at her in a way he shouldn't have. He was in a place he shouldn't have been. You can affect and impact your desires by what you look at and what you don't look at. That tree was always in the garden. Eve just hadn't looked at it, it seems, in that way before. Bathsheba had been in the kingdom for a long time. David just shouldn't have looked at her in a way that was inappropriate. You are not a helpless victim of your desires. No, you play a role in cultivating your desires based on what you put your eyes on. So when God tells you not to covet, you can actually play an active role in being intentional about what you allow yourself to look at. And if we know that we can set our desires on worldly things by continuing to put our eyes on them, then we also know that we can set our desires on God by continuing to put our eyes on him. If you don't hear anything else, I need you to hear that one. That just like you can set your desires on earthly things and temporary worldly things by setting your eyes and your attention on them, you can also grow your affection and your desire for God by intentionally setting your mind, your thoughts, your eyes, and your heart on him as well. Psalm chapter 34, verse 8 says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man," that word can be translated, happy is the man who takes refuge in him. How do we taste and see that he is good? By seeking him, by thinking on him, by believing in him. Setting your eyes on him allows you to also set your desires on him. Setting your eyes on him is how you set your desires on him. Remind yourself of his goodness, of his righteousness, of his steadfast love, and of his faithfulness. Remind yourself of how he came to rescue you from your sin when you couldn't rescue yourself. Remind yourself that he loved you so much that he came down from heaven to earth to die on the cross for your sins. Remind yourself of the power of God, that he raised Jesus from the dead. Now he has ascended into heaven with all authority and all power in his hands and all of his enemies under his feet. Remind yourself that he is coming back for you, that he will rid you of this place where you experience disappointment and pain and hurt and sadness and grief and tears. Remind yourself of the goodness of God. Set your eyes on him. Set your mind on him. And pray that through the power of the Holy Spirit, you would grow your affections and your desires for God, for him. Set your eyes on him. Taste and see that he is good by remembering his goodness all of your days. I want to go back to the psalm I read near the beginning of the sermon, Psalm 16, verses 5 through 6. It starts by saying, "The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot." Your chosen portion is whatever you choose to be enough for you. Whatever you say is enough. Your portion is whatever is enough. It's the thing that you have that causes you to be content with what you have. It's the thing that lets you say, "I'm good now because I have this." He's saying that, God, you are enough. I have enough because I have you. If I have you, then I am good. I don't need the things that I see that other people have. I'm not a slave of my desires for other things because I have the thing that I desire most of all, which is you. He's saying, you are my chosen portion. You are enough for me. I choose you. You're the thing that I look at and find contentment in. And seeing God as your chosen portion is how you wage war against the covetousness in your heart. Remembering that he is where contentment is found is how you find freedom from being enslaved to your covetous desires. And the position that David takes in verse 6 is where we often find ourselves when we walk in this truth that we see in verse 5. It says, "The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance." If you keep your eyes on the things of this world, it will breed covetousness and discontentment in your heart. If you keep your eyes on the goodness and the sufficiency of God, it will help you breed contentment with what you already have. In verse 5, David declares that God is enough. In verse 6, he declares that the things that God has given him are enough. I want to tell you today that for most of us, you're not getting to verse 6 without verse 5. You're not getting to an understanding or a belief that what you have is enough until you realize that your God is enough and you have him. And now everything else that you have is just a blessing from him. Don't try to get to verse 6 without understanding and placing faith in the proclamation of verse 5 that God is your chosen portion. And that allows us to just be grateful for every single blessing that he gives us. Because if you know God to be enough, then you won't be enslaved by your desires, by your covetousness. I find this 10th commandment fitting to conclude the 10 commandments and this sermon series that we're in. It's fitting to conclude with this command that reminds us to find our contentment in God and not in temporary things of this world. This command reminds us not only that God is for our good always, but that he is the best good always. That he is what is good. And so much of our ability to obey the commands that we've gone through throughout this whole series are determined by whether or not we find God to be good enough. You won't put other gods before him if you know he's enough. You won't make graven images and idols if we are tasting and seeing that he is good. We won't steal if we are content with who God is and what we have in God. We won't commit adultery if we don't covet what is not ours. In concluding this entire series, I just want to remind us that all of God's commandments, every one of his commandments, the 10 commandments and every other commandment that you find in Scripture, is for our good always. Whether we understand his commands or not, they are always for our good. And we know that because we know that he is the best good and that he gives us himself. And he wouldn't give us himself to bless us and grant us joy and contentment and then keep other things from us to rob us of joy and contentment. Our God is who he is. He gives us himself. He is what is the best good. And that is how we know that his commands and everything else that he gives us is for our good and is for our good always.